A bitter wind cut across the ruins of Cologne in March 1945, carrying with it the smell of dust, smoke, and shattered masonry. Tanks rumbled through the broken streets, their steel tracks chewing into rubble that had once been proud cobblestones. German soldiers, weary from endless fighting, peered nervously from behind collapsed walls, their nerves frayed by the sound of approaching engines. They knew the Americans were coming, but what they did not know was that a new predator lurked among them. A machine they had never seen before, armed with a weapon that could tear through their vaunted armor like paper. For years, German crews had ruled the battlefield with their Tigers and Panthers, armored beasts that terrified every Allied tanker who dared face them. The long-barreled 88mm gun of the Tiger I had achieved legendary status, its shells able to destroy Allied Shermans at ranges where the Americans could scarcely reply. Confidence had become a shield for German tankers, a belief that no matter how many Shermans rolled forward, German steel and German gunnery would prevail. But confidence can be a trap. By the spring of 1945, the war was shifting, and so too was the balance of power. Rolling into the fight came the M26 Pershing, a tank that the German crews were unprepared to face. Its silhouette was unfamiliar, its armor thicker than what American Shermans carried, and most importantly, its weapon was unlike anything German soldiers expected from the Allies. The Pershing mounted a 90mm gun, an instrument of destruction that gave American crews the kind of firepower they had desperately craved since Normandy. For German tankers, who had grown used to dismissing Allied tanks as weak and underarmed, this weapon would be a brutal awakening. The first time a Pershing squared off against a Panther in Cologne, the encounter was as sudden as it was decisive. The Panther, confident in its dominance, opened fire from a strong position, expecting once more to dictate the engagement. Its commander believed the American tank in his sights was just another Sherman, another helpless victim of German firepower. What he did not realize was that this time his opponent had teeth. The Pershing returned fire with its 90mm cannon, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The Panther's armor, once thought nearly impervious, crumpled under the sheer force of the shot. Flames erupted as the German crew scrambled desperately, their confidence obliterated in a single thunderous strike. This battle was not just another tank duel. It was symbolic of a turning point in armored warfare on the Western Front. For months, Allied crews had begged for something to counter the dominance of German armor. They had fought with courage in their Shermans, often relying on superior numbers and mobility rather than matching German tanks head-to-head. Losses were staggering, and tank crews joked grimly that their machines were nothing more than Ronsons, lighters that lit up the first time when hit. The Pershing changed that equation. For the first time, American crews could meet a German Panther or Tiger on more equal terms, and the Germans were not prepared for the shock. To understand why this mattered, one must step back into the mindset of German tankers in 1944 and early 1945. By then, many of them had fought countless engagements across France, Belgium, and into the Reich itself. They had destroyed hundreds of Allied tanks, often with single, well-placed shots. Veterans of the armored forces carried themselves with a sense of invincibility. Even as Germany's strategic situation collapsed, the presence of a Tiger or a Panther on the battlefield gave German infantry hope and their enemies dread. Allied tank crews respected and feared these machines, often avoiding direct confrontations unless they had overwhelming numbers or artillery support. That psychological dominance was perhaps the most dangerous weapon German armor possessed. It wasn't just about steel or guns, it was about belief. German tankers believed in their superiority, and Allied tankers believed in German superiority too. This imbalance weighed heavily in every clash. But when the Pershing arrived, that imbalance began to shift. The Pershing's gun could not only penetrate German armor at standard combat ranges, it could do so with authority. German tankers who had once laughed at the idea of an American tank standing up to them suddenly faced the reality of being outgunned. The 90mm M3 gun mounted on the Pershing was not just another Allied weapon. It was developed with lessons from both the battlefield and the skies. Its design drew from American anti-aircraft artillery, weapons built to strike at high-flying bombers with precision and immense force. Adapted for the Pershing, it became a tank killer of the highest order. Its shells carried the weight and velocity to punch through the sloped frontal armor of a Panther, something Sherman crews could rarely achieve even at close range. In the hands of trained crews, it turned the battlefield equation upside down. The psychological effect was almost immediate. Reports began to spread among German forces of a new American tank, one that could shrug off incoming fire and hit back harder than anything the Allies had fielded before. For soldiers already exhausted by years of fighting, this news was devastating. If the Allies could finally field a tank equal or superior to their prized machines, then the aura of German armored invincibility was gone. The story of German tankers blinded by their overconfidence is more than just about machines. It is about the clash between perception and reality, between arrogance and adaptation. For years, German crews had dismissed American armor as little more than cannon fodder. But the Pershing forced them to face an uncomfortable truth. The enemy had caught up. In Cologne, the wreck of that Panther stood as a symbol of this shift. Civilians hiding in basements whispered about the duel. American tankers celebrated the victory, their spirits lifted after months of hard losses. German survivors spread rumors of a Super Sherman, a tank with unheard-of power. The truth was more sobering. It wasn't a miracle weapon, but it was good enough to strip away the illusions that German crews had clung to for so long. As the war drew to its bloody close, more Pershings rolled into battle, though never in the massive numbers of Shermans. Their presence, however, was enough. Enough to terrify German crews who realized too late that their own weapons were no longer untouchable. Enough to give American crews the edge they had been denied for so long. And enough to mark the dawn of a new era in armored warfare. What made this clash so dramatic was not just the steel on steel, but the sudden collapse of certainty. The Pershing's gun was more than a weapon, it was a statement. A statement that the Allies would no longer fight with a handicap, that the days of German armor's easy dominance were numbered. For German tankers, blind to this shift until the shells began tearing through their armor, it was a rude awakening. The stage was set. The war was nearing its end, but in those last chaotic months, the arrival of the Pershing changed the dynamic of tank combat forever. In Cologne, in the shattered heart of Germany, that truth came crashing down with the thunder of a 90mm round. The battle for Cologne was more than a skirmish. It was a spectacle caught on film, broadcast later as proof that American industry had finally delivered a weapon capable of standing toe-to-toe with the armored might of the Reich. For the soldiers on the ground, though, it wasn't about propaganda. It was survival. American crews who had gone into combat with the nagging feeling that they were driving into their deaths now felt something new. A flicker of confidence. For the first time, they could fire first and expect results. The German tankers who faced them had no such reassurance. Their battlefield dominance, carved out through years of victories against underpowered foes, was cracking. In the summer of 1944, when American Sherman crews rolled into Normandy hedgerows, German armor had torn them apart. Accounts from Sherman survivors paint a grim picture. Tanks bursting into flames with single hits, crews scrambling out only to be cut down by machine gun fire, and commanders knowing they had to rely on numbers and maneuver rather than head-on engagements. By winter, this dynamic had been burned into the minds of German crews. They had every reason to believe it would continue into 1945. But warfare rarely rewards complacency. When German commanders saw the silhouette of the Pershing for the first time, many mistook it for a slightly bulkier Sherman. That mistake was fatal. In Cologne, the Panther commander believed he was taking on an old, familiar enemy, the kind he had destroyed countless times. He exposed himself in the open, fired first, and then, seconds later, watched as his own armor erupted in fire under the thunderous strike of a weapon he did not understand. The gun was everything. The 90mm M3 gave American crews the ability to dictate the fight rather than react to it. Previously, Shermans had to close the distance, maneuver into vulnerable side angles, or swarm a German tank in overwhelming numbers. Each approach carried a steep cost in lives and machines. The Pershing's weapon flipped that script. A Panther that thought itself safe at long range could suddenly find itself punched through, its sloped armor no protection against the sheer kinetic energy of the American round. To a German tanker, that was not just a tactical problem, it was a psychological collapse. The confidence that had carried them into countless battles suddenly became a liability. Tank crews who once believed themselves untouchable had to reconsider every engagement. If that new Sherman could punch through a Panther's frontal armor, what else could it do? The battlefield was no longer predictable. And unpredictability is fear. The American crews, in contrast, experienced a shift just as dramatic but far more uplifting. For years, they had been the underdogs. Sherman crews knew their tanks were vulnerable, and they fought with grim determination rather than expectation of victory. They learned to outthink their opponents, to use smoke, flanking maneuvers, and sheer audacity to close in and disable a German machine before it disabled them. Each battle felt like a gamble, survival uncertain, victory bought with blood. The Pershing gave them something they had never truly had: parity. The 90mm cannon wasn't magic. It required training, nerves, and good judgment. But it gave American tankers a chance to fight without relying solely on luck or numbers. They could finally take a shot across open ground and trust that the round would land with enough force to make a difference. That change in mentality was powerful. The crews weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting with a belief that they could win. For the Germans, denial set in at first. Reports of the Pershing trickled through the ranks, often confused and exaggerated. Some believed it was simply a heavily modified Sherman. Others whispered that it was an experimental supertank rushed into battle. The truth was less dramatic but no less consequential. The Americans had learned, adapted, and caught up. What German crews had dismissed as impossible, an Allied tank capable of frontal duels, was now rolling into their streets and fields. In Cologne, the clash had been caught on camera by Signal Corps photographers. The footage became iconic. A duel in the ruins, a German Panther hulking in the open, then suddenly engulfed in fire as the Pershing's round struck home. For those watching from afar, it was cinematic proof of change. For those inside the tanks, it was life and death. The German crew, blinded by assumption, fought as if it were still 1944. The Pershing crew fought as if the future had just arrived, and in that moment it had. The significance of the Pershing's debut was not in numbers. Only about 20 Pershings were shipped to Europe before Germany's surrender. They did not swarm the battlefield the way Shermans did. But presence mattered. The Germans no longer knew what to expect. Every time a tank silhouette appeared on the horizon, the question lingered. Was it just another Sherman? Or was it one of the new machines armed with a gun that could pierce their armor with ease? That uncertainty gnawed at them. The power of perception should not be underestimated. The German armored force had thrived on it, building an aura of invincibility around their Panthers and Tigers. Once that aura was cracked, even slightly, it began to crumble. The Pershing didn't need to be everywhere. It just needed to exist. Its very presence introduced doubt into German strategy. Commanders could no longer order their tanks into open duels with casual confidence. Crews could no longer assume that their opponents were doomed before the first shot was fired. As the war in Europe lurched toward its conclusion, the Pershing's arrival was one of many signals that the German war machine was faltering. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies. The Wehrmacht was retreating on multiple fronts. Supplies were dwindling, morale was collapsing, and the Allies were pressing in from all sides. Yet for German tankers, the appearance of an American gun that rivaled or exceeded their own was a personal blow. It stripped away the last psychological advantage they clung to. Some veterans later admitted that by 1945, they knew the war was lost, but they had still held on to the belief that their machines were unmatched. That belief gave them purpose, even as defeat loomed. The Pershing shattered it. When the 90mm gun tore through their armor, it was more than just a round striking steel. It was the end of an illusion. The irony was that the Pershing had arrived too late to truly change the war. If it had been fielded in Normandy, the cost in Allied lives might have been far lower. If it had rolled into the Battle of the Bulge in numbers, German armor could have been blunted far more quickly. But wars are not fought with hypotheticals. By March 1945, the Pershing was not a war winner, but it was a war ender. It announced to German crews that their time was over, and it gave American crews the vindication they had long sought. The duel in Cologne was just the beginning. More encounters would follow in the final months, each one reinforcing the same lesson. German armor was no longer untouchable. The Pershing's gun brought parity to the battlefield, and parity was all the Allies needed to push their advantage home. The city lay in ruins, civilians displaced, soldiers exhausted, and yet within the chaos, one duel stood out as a turning point in perception. It wasn't the largest battle or the bloodiest, but in that clash of steel, the Germans saw a glimpse of their own downfall. The Americans, for once, looked across the battlefield and saw not giants, but equals. The duel in Cologne was a flashpoint, but the reverberations traveled far beyond a single ruined city. Every soldier who witnessed the clash carried its story, and soon the tale spread across units like wildfire. American crews shared the footage with pride, while German officers whispered of a new enemy weapon that threatened their armored dominance. The Pershing's arrival had shifted the conversation from despair to possibility, from arrogance to unease. The battlefield, however, does not bend easily to perception alone. For all its power, the Pershing remained scarce. Barely 20 units reached Europe before Germany's collapse, and they were dispersed across divisions in ones and twos rather than concentrated in mass formations. Yet scarcity amplified their mystique. Rumors magnified their presence. A German tanker might spot a bulky silhouette in the distance and, for a brief, paralyzing moment, wonder if it was one of the dreaded 90mm gunners. That hesitation could be fatal. German armor doctrine had been forged in the crucible of rapid offensives. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, shock, and the belief that German machines were inherently superior. By 1945, this doctrine was fraying. Fuel shortages limited mobility. The Luftwaffe could no longer shield columns from Allied airstrikes. Factories were bombed relentlessly, starving the front of spare parts and replacements. Even without the Pershing, German armor was on the defensive, retreating through villages and cities that were themselves crumbling under artillery and bombing campaigns. The Pershing added a new layer of dread. Its gun erased the comfort zones German tankers had relied on. A Panther that once felt safe at 1,500 meters was suddenly vulnerable. A Tiger that had shrugged off countless 75mm hits could no longer assume it would survive frontal duels. Crews who had grown used to fighting with near impunity now faced uncertainty in every engagement. The Americans understood this, and they used it to their advantage. In after-action reports, Pershing crews often described engagements in which German tanks retreated rather than pressed their attacks. One commander noted that his platoon advanced through a town with minimal resistance, not because the enemy had fled entirely, but because German tankers were hesitant to expose themselves to a gun they didn't fully understand. The aura of invincibility had shifted. It was not just the weapon that unnerved German crews, it was the implication. If the Americans had fielded a tank with this kind of firepower, how many more were waiting? War thrives on speculation, and the Germans speculated constantly. Every new silhouette was a question mark. Every delayed Allied offensive might be buying time for more Pershings to arrive. The psychological pressure grew heavier as rumors of super tanks spread through the ranks. Inside those tanks, life remained brutal. Pershing crews described the cramped interiors, the constant rattle of machinery, and the nerve-wracking silence as they waited for contact. The gun was powerful, but the fear of ambush lingered. German tank destroyers still lurked in forests and fields, their 88mm guns more than capable of cracking even the Pershing's armor. Mines, Panzerfausts, and artillery fire made every advance hazardous. The Pershing gave confidence, but it did not give invulnerability. Crews knew that one mistake could still cost them everything. For the Germans, the emotional weight was heavier. Panther crews who once reveled in the sharp crack of their 75mm high-velocity gun now questioned whether their shots would matter. Tiger commanders, once proud to duel at long range, found themselves scanning the horizon nervously, wondering if they were walking into a trap. The balance of fear had shifted. Both sides were afraid, but for the first time, the Americans were not afraid alone. The Cologne duel became emblematic, but it was far from the only encounter. In subsequent weeks, Pershings clashed with German tanks in towns and villages across western Germany. Each fight reinforced the same pattern. When the Pershing's 90 mm found its mark, German armor crumpled. A Panther struck at 1,200 meters. A Tiger disabled after an exchange it should have won. The statistics were few, but they spoke volumes. For every American tank lost, multiple German machines were destroyed. Yet even as the Pershing proved itself, the war's clock was ticking down. By March 1945, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. German defenses were collapsing not just because of tanks, but because of overwhelming force on every front. Infantry divisions were shattered, supply chains broken, cities bombed into ash. The Wehrmacht was running on fumes. Against that backdrop, the Pershing was less a game-changer and more a symbol. Proof that even in the technical domain, the Germans no longer held superiority. It is easy, in hindsight, to see the Pershing as overdue. American tank crews had begged for better firepower since Normandy. Reports of Shermans destroyed by single German shells filled Allied command desks for months. Engineers had tested prototypes, debated designs, and pushed for production, but bureaucracy and logistics slowed everything down. By the time the Pershing finally arrived, thousands of lives had already been lost to undergun Shermans. To many veterans, the Pershing was both a triumph and a bitter reminder. It could have come earlier, and it could have saved so many more. Still, its impact cannot be understated. In war, perception is as powerful as steel. The Pershing gave American crews faith, and it robbed German crews of certainty. That psychological reversal was invaluable in a conflict already tilting toward Allied victory. In Cologne, the duel had shown the world what was possible. In the following months, it confirmed it. The days of German tank dominance were over. The streets of Germany bore the scars of this change. Burned-out hulks of Panthers and Tigers dotted crossroads and fields, silent testaments to the end of an era. Civilians who once watched German armor thunder through their towns now saw it limping, retreating, or smoldering. The Pershing was not everywhere, but where it appeared, it left an impression. To soldiers, it was a relief. To enemies, it was a nightmare. To history, it was a marker of transition, from the terror of the early war years to the inevitability of Allied victory. And yet, within that inevitability, stories of individual duels still matter. War is made of statistics, but it is remembered through moments. The clash in Cologne, the rumors in the field, the hesitation of a German crew staring down a gun they had not seen before. All of these illustrate a truth larger than numbers. Power is not only measured in how many tanks one side fields, but in how those tanks make the other side feel. In 1945, the Pershing made German tankers feel something they had not felt in years, doubt. The Pershing had proven its worth, but its story was far from finished. What mattered next was not just how it fought in the dying days of World War II, but how it shaped the post-war world. The men who designed it, the crews who manned it, and the armies who observed it all carried lessons forward. The tank was more than a weapon, it was a statement, and its echoes would ripple into the Cold War. The Pershing's thunderous debut was proof of what American engineers could achieve when pressed by necessity. But its story was also one of delays, politics, and missed opportunities. 4 years before Cologne, U.S. tank crews had been sounding the alarm. The Sherman, reliable though it was simply not enough against the Panthers and Tigers that prowled Europe. Letters from the front, after-action reports, and even commanders' pleas all carried the same message. American crews were dying in machines that could not match their opponents. Yet for too long, those warnings went unanswered. The U.S. Army had entered the war with a philosophy of mobility and reliability over raw firepower. In 1942, this seemed logical. Shermans could be produced in massive numbers, shipped across oceans, and maintained in the field with relative ease. A single Tiger might outgun a Sherman, but America could field 10 Shermans for every German heavy tank. It was a war of attrition, and U.S. planners believed numbers would tell in the end. That belief came at a cost. By the time Allied forces stormed Normandy in June 1944, Sherman crews faced the grim arithmetic of combat. A Panther at 1,500 meters could knock out Shermans before they even closed the distance. Crews developed tactics born of desperation. Smoke screens, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated swarms designed to overwhelm a single German tank with sheer volume of fire. These tactics worked, but at a terrible price. Entire crews were lost, machines burned, and morale frayed under the knowledge that they were always outmatched in direct confrontations. In this environment, the Pershing could have been a savior. Its 90mm gun had been tested long before, and its design had been debated in engineering circles since 1942. But bureaucratic wrangling, logistical hesitations, and the stubborn belief in Sherman's sufficiency delayed its arrival. The Ordnance Department, tank commanders, and even high-ranking generals could not agree on priorities. Producing a new tank at scale meant diverting resources, adjusting factories, and risking delays in supplying the steady stream of Shermans already rolling into Europe. By the time the green light came, the war's decisive battles were already being fought. The Pershing prototypes finally arrived in early 1945, too late for Normandy, too late for the Bulge, but just in time to prove that they could have made a difference all along. For the men who had begged for better armor, the Pershing's appearance was bittersweet. They welcomed it, but they could not forget the friends and comrades lost in Sherman coffins. One veteran later put it simply, "The Pershing was the tank we needed in 44. In 45, it was the tank we wished we had sooner." German crews, meanwhile, were shocked to discover that America had closed the gap. For years they had derided Allied tanks as inferior, relying on the myth of German engineering supremacy to bolster their own morale. The Pershing punctured that myth. Here was an American machine that could fight on equal terms, matching their guns, shrugging off hits, and striking back with lethal force. It was a late arrival, but its psychological weight was immense. The duel in Cologne symbolized this shift, but it was only part of the story. In the Ruhr pocket, during the crossing of the Rhine, and in countless smaller clashes, Pershings proved themselves again and again. They were few in number, yet each victory carried symbolic weight far beyond the battlefield. German crews who once assumed they could dominate any fight now had to consider retreat, caution, or even surrender when confronted with this new threat. For American crews, the Pershing also changed the rhythm of combat. Instead of charging blindly into duels they knew they might not win, they could now maneuver with confidence. Instead of praying for a flank shot, they could take frontal engagements. The relief was palpable, even if it came late. For the first time, they were not simply surviving, they were fighting on even terms. But the war was ending, and the Pershing's late arrival meant its true influence would be felt not in the ruins of Germany, but in the dawn of the Cold War. Military planners, both American and Soviet, studied its performance closely. The lessons were clear. Future wars would not be won by sheer numbers alone. Firepower, armor, and psychological dominance mattered just as much. The Pershing became the ancestor of post-war American armor, influencing designs that would dominate the 1950s and 1960s. Its Soviet counterpart, the T-34, had already set a global standard for mass-producible, effective tanks. The Pershing, in contrast, pointed toward a different future, heavier, more powerful machines designed to go toe-to-toe with the best of the enemy. In this way, the duel in Cologne was not only the end of one war, but the beginning of another. The legacy of the Pershing also lay in memory. Veterans never forgot the relief of finally having a weapon that could match the German giants. They told their stories with pride, but also with lingering frustration at how long it had taken. Historians would later debate whether the delays were avoidable, whether the U.S. should have shifted its focus earlier, and how many lives might have been saved had the Pershing entered the battlefield in 1944. The answers are complex, but the sentiment remains. The Pershing arrived late, but when it did, it proved its worth beyond question. For German veterans, memories of encountering the Pershing were often tinged with disbelief. Some recalled duels where their shots simply bounced off the armor they expected to penetrate. Others admitted that by the war's end, they no longer felt they held the upper hand. The tank they had mocked as another Sherman revealed itself to be a predator, and they were its prey. On both sides, the Pershing marked a turning point, not in the war's outcome, which was already sealed, but in the perception of American military capability. It showed the world that the United States could not only produce in vast numbers but could also innovate and field cutting-edge machines. That message would resonate far beyond 1945, shaping perceptions of American power for decades to come. The story of the Pershing is, therefore, not just about steel and fire. It is about the intersection of technology, timing, and human cost. It is about the crews who begged for it, the commanders who delayed it, and the enemies who underestimated it. It is about how a single duel, caught on film in the ruins of Cologne, could symbolize both the tragedy of delay and the triumph of innovation. And as the war wound down, the Pershing's shadow grew longer. Not because it had won the war. Sherman's artillery, air power, and sheer manpower had carried that burden, but because it represented the future. The age of undergun tanks was over. The battlefield had entered a new era, and the Pershing had fired the opening shot. In the ruins of Europe, where cities lay shattered and armies collapsed, the Pershing stood as both a weapon of war and a symbol of what could have been. For the tank crews who drove it, there was pride in its power but also a gnawing sense of lateness. They knew the machine beneath them had the strength to stand up to tigers and panthers without relying on sacrifice and desperation. They also knew that thousands of their comrades had fought and died without such protection. That knowledge never left them. The Pershing story was always about timing. Had it arrived in Normandy in June 1944, it could have rewritten the narrative of armored combat in Western Europe. Sherman's would still have outnumbered it, but even a few dozen Pershings sprinkled across the beaches and hedgerows would have shifted morale, tactics, and survival rates. German tank crews, who fought with confidence through much of the summer, might have faced hesitation. American crews, so often forced into risky maneuvers, could have fought with assurance. Instead, the Pershing rolled into battle only as the war's end loomed. Yet even with its late debut, its impact was undeniable. In Cologne, its duel against a panther was immortalized on film, showing not just a single victory, but the arrival of a new force on the battlefield. In the Ruhr, in the drive to the Elbe, and in countless smaller encounters, Pershings demonstrated that the U.S. could build machines to rival the best of Germany's arsenal. It was a message heard by friend and foe alike. America was not only the arsenal of democracy but also a rising giant in armored warfare. For German crews, the shock of facing the Pershing was a bitter taste of their fading dominance. For years, they had relied on technical superiority to counter overwhelming Allied numbers. Their Tigers and Panthers, though plagued by mechanical issues and supply shortages, gave them a psychological edge. Each confrontation with Sherman's felt like a duel they were favored to win. The Pershing erased that edge. Suddenly, the Americans had a tank that could punch through frontal armor and absorb punishment in return. The psychological tables turned quickly. By spring 1945, the once feared German giants were often hunted rather than hunters. But the Pershing was not just a battlefield weapon. It was also a blueprint. Its lessons echoed far beyond Cologne. Military planners around the world studied it closely, seeing in its design the seeds of the next generation of tanks. Heavier armor, larger guns, and a shift away from the light-medium-heavy classification toward the idea of a single main battle tank. The Pershing's DNA would flow into the M46, the M47, and eventually into the M60 Patton series, machines that would dominate American armored forces for decades. Its influence reached even further, shaping NATO doctrine and setting the stage for how tanks would be used in the Cold War. The Soviets took note as well. They had already fielded the T-34, a marvel of mass production and battlefield effectiveness, but they understood what the Pershing represented. It was not about numbers anymore, it was about balance. Firepower, armor, and mobility all had to come together. The duel between the Pershing and the Panther was not just an isolated clash. It was a preview of the kind of confrontations that could define a future war between East and West. Back home, the Pershing became part of a larger story of American military innovation. To the public, it was another example of how the United States could overcome challenges, even if belatedly. To veterans, it was a reminder of what might have been different. Letters, memoirs, and interviews often returned to the same point. The Pershing was brilliant, but too late. That sense of lateness haunted the memory of many Sherman crews who had faced the brutal odds of 1944. Still, for all its timing flaws, the Pershing achieved something invaluable. It destroyed the myth of German invincibility. The Tiger and Panther were no longer untouchable titans. The duel in Cologne proved that American crews, in American machines, could fight them head-on and win. The psychological shift was as powerful as any battlefield maneuver. Once that illusion cracked, the aura of German armored supremacy crumbled with it. The legacy of the Pershing also rests in its symbolism. It was not the tank that won World War II, that honor in raw numbers belonged to the Sherman. Nor was it the most numerous, nor the most celebrated at the time. But it was the tank that showed what was possible when American industry, ingenuity, and necessity came together. It was the bridge between the desperate improvisations of 1944 and the armored dominance of the Cold War. Today, when historians and enthusiasts look back at World War II, the Pershing occupies a strange place. It was too few, too late, and yet unforgettable. Its duels are studied, its footage replayed, its design analyzed not because it was everywhere, but because it was just enough to make a difference and just rare enough to spark the imagination. Standing before the wrecked Panther in Cologne, one sees more than twisted metal. One sees a turning point, a reminder that wars are not just fought with numbers or strategies, but with moments where technology, courage, and timing intersect to change the course of history. The Pershing provided such a moment. It did not arrive to win the war, but to signal what came after. As the last shots of the war echoed across Europe, the Pershing rolled forward into history. Its gun was silent now, but its presence spoke volumes. For the men who fought in it, it was both vindication and lament. For their enemies, it was the final blow to the illusion of superiority. For the generations that followed, it was the beginning of a new chapter in armored warfare. The Pershing was not just a tank. It was a message carved in steel. America had learned, adapted, and arrived. Too late to save every life it might have, but just in time to shape the wars and the world that followed.